So imagine you're standing in the middle of Australia's wide desert. The sun is scorching and the land continues endlessly. It makes crossing it feel almost impossible. Back in the 1800s, crossing the desert was a real problem for settlers and explorers. So, what did they do? They brought in donkeys. At first, it seemed like such a brilliant solution. Donkeys are dependable and tough, and soon these animals became vital for survival. But over time, things changed. The decision to bring donkeys into the Australian desert brought things that no one had ever expected. It created consequences that Australia is still dealing with today. Let's find out what happened. Now, to find out exactly how donkeys ended up in Australia, we need to rewind to the mid-1800s. Back then, settlers were still struggling with the tough inland. Horses and oxen were used, but they had limits because the climate was so harsh. And although camels were brought in by the mid-1800s, they weren't widely used until some decades later, so settlers looked for another animal that could handle the desert conditions. And that's when the donkeys came in. Imported from a variety of sources and places, donkeys showed that they were hardy, patient, and surprisingly strong for their size. They were soon seen as a cheaper and more reliable option. The donkeys didn't need lush grass and they drank less water than horses, so they were the perfect choice to work in Australia's tough conditions. Initially, there weren't that many of them. The first reasonable imports kicked off around the 1820s to the 1840s, and not long after, as gold rush towns and inland stations popped up, the donkey demand began to rise pretty fast. People used them to haul supplies, carry equipment, and transport water barrels across long distances. Little by little, donkeys became more common in the area. Over time, their reputation grew. Yes, they were slow, but they also rarely broke down. Settlers soon discovered that a team of donkeys could keep walking even when other animals gave up. That reliability was worth much more than speed in the middle of a desert. In fact, when many pastoralists realized this, they began to breed them locally rather than pay to import new ones. Because donkeys could survive in almost any environment, they were often turned loose once settlers no longer needed them. Sometimes miners left them behind when the gold fields they worked in closed, and other times cattlemen abandoned them after the season's work was over. On rare occasions, these resilient animals even escaped. By the late 1800s, donkeys in Australia were still mostly pack animals. However, the seeds for them to become a much bigger problem were already being planted. But before we get into that, we'll have to see how exactly the donkeys survived in the wild. Well, remember I mentioned that they didn't need that much water. Donkeys can go without water for long periods of time. They graze on dry shrubs and tough grasses that other livestock ignore, allowing them to thrive in the same desert that other cattle struggled in. And another thing that helped, the donkeys that escaped or were abandoned formed small herds. These herds moved into remote areas, especially in Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Unlike cattle or sheep, which needed people to guide and manage them, donkeys spread on their own. They walked long distances, foraging as they went, and they quickly colonized new ground. That independence, combined with human behavior, became a big factor in their spread and domination as the main desert animal. During the early 1900s, as motor vehicles and rail lines expanded, settlers stopped relying so much on animal transport. Camels and donkeys were gradually replaced by trucks. Rather than keep them penned and fed, many owners simply let them loose. After all, why spend money caring for animals that were no longer useful? As a result, sightings of these wild donkeys date back to the early 1900s. By the mid-20th century, reports of wild donkey herds became more widespread. Farmers spotted them drinking at watering holes, and rangers noticed them traveling in groups across desert tracks. And these donkeys weren't just surviving, they were spreading into areas that people least expected them to be. Donkeys are able to climb rocky ridges, squeeze through scrub, and trek long distances without getting tired. That mobility meant they were not confined to one small corner of the desert. Instead, they expanded into the Kimberley region, parts of the Pilbara, and deep into the Northern Territory. Under normal circumstances, a few donkeys out on their own isn't a problem. But there was another not-so-small problem. Their numbers kept increasing. Donkeys can reproduce steadily under favorable conditions, unlike other large stock animals. It also helped that the Australian desert had limited predators. Yes, dingoes sometimes took foals, but the adult donkeys were rarely threatened. That means their populations weren't checked by predators the way they should have been, and the situation was starting to get concerning. Unfortunately, by 1949, wild donkey numbers grew so high in Western Australia that the government officially declared them a pest species. Their growing numbers were beginning to add pressure to the already fragile desert landscape. By the time donkey numbers reached the hundreds of thousands, the damage they brought was blatant. Australia's desert and savanna landscapes are fragile. Waterholes, native grasses, and dry season pastures barely support the native animals that evolved there, so throwing lots of feral donkey herds into the mix puts an enormous strain on already stressed ecosystems. The first and most obvious issue was grazing pressure. Remember I mentioned that donkeys eat a wide range of plants and grasses that cattle and sheep often overlook. At first it might sound like a benefit, but unchecked, it can quickly become a problem. Donkeys were eating the same plants that native animals relied on during tough seasons. As a result, the native wildlife faced more competition to find food. Water was another issue. In arid parts of Australia, permanent waterholes are rare and very important. Donkeys often flocked to these watering spots in massive numbers. They trampled the edges, muddied the water, and usually stayed for long periods of time. As a result, smaller animals avoided the sites when they became overrun. For pastoralists, this meant their stock also found it difficult to access clean water. Over time, the heavy trampling damaged the fragile soils around water points, and it caused erosion that could take decades to heal. Donkeys also directly impacted the structure of the land. Their hard hooves compacted soil as they moved across long distances. As a result, this compaction reduced the soil's ability to absorb rain. Additionally, in the dry outback, where every drop of water matters, this change worsened the effects of drought and made the landscape even less forgiving. Infrastructure damage was yet another constant complaint. Donkeys broke fences, especially when they looked for water or food on the other side. In some cases, donkey herds destroyed troughs and tanks just by crowding around them. This was very bad news for landowners who were already dealing with other issues. The effects of the donkeys added yet another costly challenge. Moreover, there was the question of disease. Donkeys, like other livestock, can carry and spread parasites and illnesses. Although Australia works hard to control diseases or parasites that affect horses and cattle, the presence of large unmanaged donkey herds was really concerning. Wild donkeys moving across vast ranges were almost impossible to monitor or treat. And there was still one more problem: the issue of biodiversity. Donkeys moved into habitats that had never seen hoofed animals before Europeans settled there. Soon, wetlands, rocky ridges, and desert springs felt the impact. Over time, ecologists raised alarms. They warned that native plants were disappearing faster than they could grow back. The situation got so bad, in some regions, rare vegetation communities were at risk of being permanently changed. So when the 20th century came around, scientists and policymakers couldn't dismiss the problem any longer. The donkeys were reshaping the ecological landscape of Australia, and not in a good way. By that time, donkey numbers had exploded across northern Australia, and the pressure they were adding was clear. Landowners were struggling. Governments were worried. Conservationists were speaking up. Everyone could see that something had to change. But how exactly do you manage thousands of wild animals scattered across the deserts of Australia? The initial efforts to control the donkey populations weren't anything grand. Rather, they were small and local. Station owners tried shooting donkeys near waterholes or setting up traps to catch them. Now, these methods did remove a few animals, but they barely put a dent in the entire population. Donkeys are intelligent and wary, so if pressure built up in one area, they simply moved elsewhere. By the mid-20th century, larger-scale programs began. The government started organizing coordinated culls, especially from the air. Helicopter shooting became one of the most common and effective methods. Pilots flew over remote desert regions while marksmen targeted herds from above. It was expensive, but it let them access places that were almost impossible to reach by land. For pastoralists whose fences and waterholes were damaged, the aerial culling method was a welcome relief. Still, helicopters could only cover so much ground, and the numbers seemed endless. That led to one of the most ambitious projects in pest management, and that's the use of the Judas donkey method. The idea was simple, but quite brilliant. A wild donkey would be caught, fitted with a radio collar, and then released back into the wild. Because donkeys are very social, the donkey would meet up with the others. Once it joins a herd, trackers can follow the signal to locate the entire herd. This system allowed marksmen to remove large numbers at once instead of chasing them one at a time across the desert. The Judas program was really effective. It was tested initially in the Northern Territory during the 1980s, and it also worked really well in regions like the Kimberley later on. Over time, it became a key tool to reduce the donkey numbers to levels that were easier to manage. In fact, many other countries later borrowed the same method for different species, including goats and pigs. Despite these successes, removing all the donkeys still didn't seem possible. Australia is really vast and has lots of places where animals can hide. Instead, the focus shifted to control. The Australians had to find a way to keep the donkey populations low so that they'd stop damaging the environment and infrastructure. The cost, however, was pretty high. Aerial culls, collaring, and ground operations needed funding, as well as coordination and manpower. For cash-strapped governments and remote landholders, sustaining long-term campaigns was always a challenge. That meant donkey numbers often came back if the efforts slowed down a bit. Another layer of debate came from ethics. Animal welfare groups were concerned about the aerial shootings and large-scale culls. They worried about how much the donkeys would suffer from these methods. However, those that supported the control measures countered them. They argued that the environmental and agricultural costs of unchecked populations were far greater. Even with these challenges, the results were very noticeable. In some regions, donkey numbers dropped dramatically. Additionally, waterholes recovered, vegetation had a chance to regrow, and livestock had easier access to resources. But in other, less accessible areas, donkeys continued to thrive. And the fact that they continued to thrive served as a reminder to everyone that the issue was far from solved. After all, since these animals are so resilient and independent, a minor migration of only a few herds could potentially repopulate the areas where their numbers have dropped and start the cycle again. As a result, by the 2000s, feral donkey management had become a steady and long-term part of Australia's bigger fight against invasive species, alongside camels, horses, pigs, and cats. That's why Australia's donkey story is far from over. Today, feral donkeys are still spread across large areas of northern and central Australia. In fact, while there was a significant drop in their numbers in some regions, their populations remain strong in other regions, especially in the rugged or less accessible landscapes. So the question now isn't about whether they're gone, but rather how to keep them in check without repeating the vicious cycle. Yet even after decades of control efforts, there are quite a few modern challenges. One of them is cost. Large-scale aerial culling campaigns, Judas donkey programs, and ground-based shooting all need steady funding. However, the budgets to manage invasive species are limited. After all, donkeys are not the only animals causing headaches. Extermination of other invasive species are also competing for those funds, too. That means the donkey control often gets scaled back once their numbers become manageable. Unfortunately, when that happens, the herds can quickly rebound. People are also starting to become more aware of how donkey management keys into the bigger picture of the environment. For instance, if donkey pressure at waterholes reduces, the native species will get a chance to thrive. In a similar way, reducing donkey numbers helps protect vegetation cover. That matters because healthy cover stops soil erosion and supports local wildlife. So the issue with donkeys is not just about the animals themselves, it ties directly into the larger goal of protecting Australia's unique ecosystems. Moreover, there's the challenge of geography. Australia's outback is massive, and monitoring every corner is virtually impossible. On top of that, there's the issue of perception. To some people, feral donkeys are destructive pests that harm fragile ecosystems and cost people money, while others see them as part of the culture. Some people even see donkeys as part of Australia's frontier history. They remember how the animals once helped with travel and heavy loads. But others, especially animal rights groups, focus on their welfare. They argue donkeys should not face harsh culling or rough removal, and because of these different views, every new control plan tends to spark arguments and tension. Meanwhile, researchers and land managers are testing different approaches. New technology is starting to shift the way control efforts are planned and carried out. Better GPS collars, drones, and satellite monitoring now make it easier to track herds across difficult terrain. Additionally, some programs are even testing how to control donkey fertility. However, applying it to animals spread far and wide is still a huge logistical hurdle. Looking ahead, many experts agree on one main point. Totally eradicating the donkeys isn't possible. Australia is simply too big, and the donkeys are spread too far to remove them all. So, the more practical approach is to focus on managing their numbers over the long term. They'll work on keeping the donkey numbers low and make sure that control programs are ready to respond when their populations rise again. Generally, there's a mixed outlook. Sure, Australia created some of the most innovative pest control techniques in the world, including the famous Judas method, but keeping up with those techniques needs funding, political will, and continuous support from the public. Donkeys may never totally disappear from the desert as a whole, but their impact can be shaped. But here's something fascinating that often gets overlooked. Donkeys in Australia aren't just a problem. In some cases, they've been put to work as part of the solution. A few conservation projects have experimented with using donkeys as biological tools in remote rangelands. For example, in parts of the Kimberley, researchers noticed that donkeys digging for water during dry months sometimes uncovered hidden springs. These shallow wells, nicknamed donkey pits, accidentally created water points that other animals like kangaroos, emus, and even small birds relied on. It's an odd reminder that even invasive species can sometimes play unexpected roles. There's also a cultural side to the story. In rural towns, donkeys have become part of folklore and even tourism. Festivals and community events sometimes feature donkey rides or parades, celebrating the animal's role in Australia's frontier history. To many older Australians, the sound of a braying donkey still brings back memories of outback travel and goldfield settlements. This complicated legacy makes management more than just a scientific challenge. It's also about balancing heritage with environmental responsibility. And looking to the future, new research is considering fertility control as a humane alternative to mass culling. Imagine darting a donkey with a contraceptive that quietly prevents it from reproducing. While this technology is still in testing, it could offer land managers another tool alongside helicopters and Judas donkeys. It's proof that the story of Australia's donkeys isn't finished. It's still evolving with new twists on the horizon. Australia's donkey problem is one that brings up lots of opinions from various people. How do you feel about Australia's approach to managing their donkey populations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And thanks so much for watching until the very end. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you won't miss our next updates.